A very good morning to everyone. Welcome to the virtual launch of My Climate Action Guide, organized by UN Global Compact Network Malaysia and Brunei in partnership with Tata Consultancy Services, Nottingham University Business School, and Central College Penang. Thank you for joining us today. We are delighted to have you with us today. My name is Najwa, and I am honored to be your MC for the launch. So apart from this launch today, I would like to share with you the significance of today's date. 29th July 2021 is not just another Thursday, it also marks the Earth Overshoot Day for this year. So you must be wondering, on what is the Earth Overshoot Day? This day marks the date when humanity has exhausted nature's budget for the year. For the rest of the year, we are maintaining our ecological deficit by drawing down local resource stocks and accumulating carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Sadly, this year's Earth Overshoot Day is much earlier than last year's, which was on 22nd August 2020. This shows that we are using more resources in a shorter amount of time, and immediate actions must be taken to tackle climate change by everyone, especially the private sectors. My Climate Action Guide aims to help corporate sustainability practitioners and business owners to position climate change within their companies as a core business concern. So before we move on to the rest of the event today, I would like to share today's agenda with you briefly. We will start this event with the opening remarks from Mr. Farouz Nada, the Executive Director of UN Global Compact Malaysia and Brunei, and Mr. Jeevan Raju, the Country Head of Tata Consultancy Services. Next, we also have Justin Wu, the Head of Asia Pacific Bloomberg NEF, to deliver his presentation on the future of business trade in a net zero economy. Following up on that, we are joined by Dato' Engineer Dr. Siti Hamisah Binti Tafsir, the Secretary General of Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, MOSTI, as our special keynote speaker and officially launched My Climate Action Guide through a video recording. Lastly, we will also be introduced to the My Climate Action Guide by Jess, the lead of research and advocacy from UN Global Compact Network, Malaysia and Brunei. Without further ado, I would like to pass the mic to Mr. Farouz Nada, the Executive Director of UN Global Compact Network, Malaysia and Brunei, to give his welcoming remark.
Thank you, Najwa. Assalamualaikum and good morning to all, and thank you for joining us for our launch event. The need for climate action has given us a shared global vision. Irrespective if you're a business or non-business actor, small or large organization, as we are all exposed to the existential crisis of our generation and generations to come. In a recent report by Wall Street Journal, it is predicted that climate change impact could cut Malaysia's economic growth by 20% by 2050. And to combat climate change, our thinking and approach must change. Case in point, the race to net zero, with zero being the ultimate positive for businesses to achieve their contribution towards a more sustainable world. And this is our approach for the My Climate Action Guide, for us to provide localized insights and localized tools that would inspire culture change, needed time-bound target settings, and measurable actions for Malaysian business actors to be change agents for a net zero world, of which a more detailed overview will be provided towards the end of this program today. Instead of using environmental pictures, we illustrated this guide with competitive cycling analogy that businesses must be disciplined, have the required toolkits, be driven by strategy based on data, desire to beat the clock, and a collaborative team culture. Most of all, though, it illustrates that all of us, no matter the color of jerseys, are headed to the same destination, to the same finish line, to win the race to net zero. Of course, it would be a welcome bonus if we celebrate our first goal thanks to our cycling champions in Tokyo as well, inshallah. I take this opportunity to thank my team, our partners, TCS, Nottingham Business School, Central College, and various contributors for collective effort in producing and making these guides available free to use for all. I also thank Justin Wu of Bloomberg NEF for sharing his insights today, and to our VIP guest, Dr. Siti Hamisa, the KSU of MOSTI. Today is also World Overshoot Day, which marks the date in which we consume more resources than what our increasingly fragile Earth can provide us in a year. I do hope today we have made a small contribution in ensuring next year's World Overshoot Day and all remaining overshoot days take longer and longer to come. I wish all an insightful event, and please do share the My Climate Action Guides to all your networks. In parting, the race to net zero is not yet lost. Science tells us that it's a race that we can win, and let's win this together. Terima kasih.
Thank you, Mr. Faraz Nada. Up next, I would like to invite Mr. Jeevan Raju, the head of Tata Consultancy Services, to give his welcoming remark. Mr. Jeevan?
Selamat pagi, selamat sejahtera. Very good morning to my fellow friends, to the listeners of this particular session. It gives me great pleasure to share with you our thoughts and our partnership with UN Impact Global, with Bloomberg, and University of Nottingham. I just want to take you down a road in 10 years from now. Imagine you live in a house, and that house is completely has food in there for you to consume for the next couple of years. And if the consumption of the food in that house depletes faster than the rate of it being replenished, the people in the house and the kids in the house will gradually get into starvation. And that's really what's happening today with climate. The food and the house that we live in together is really in the state of starvation, and we are probably going to be moving into a paradigm whereby our kids, our grandkids will have to pay the consequences of it. And the consequences are because of industrialization by us and many of our forefathers, which we put profit before people and nature. And because of all of that, today you can see the pandemic has impacted the world such in an immense amount. And we today trying to recalibrate the way we look at the world, we recalibrate the way we work with our families, we recalibrate the way we do business in different parts of the world. But this recalibration has to happen now, in terms of all business that you use, all business, irrespective whether you're a banker, you're an oil and gas guy, you're a telco, or you're even a manufacturing organization, the recalibration needs to happen now. I want to share with you a few extracts from this particular book. And it's a phenomenal book if you haven't had, once you get a chance to read it. It contextualizes Malaysia and what Malaysia is doing from climate change. Today, there is 35.3 trillion worth of funding given for global sustainable investments. And that is going to keep growing year on year. 1/3 of that is coming out from US, Europe, Canada, Australia, and Japan. We in Malaysia are nowhere to be seen in that scene. You're going to see Malaysia green bonds and SUSOP being increased by a factor of 3 times in the next couple of years. What it means is you will see access to finance, access to capital much more easier to be obtained if you're much more greener in your operations, in so to speak. So you see a lot of investments are going to solar farms, they're going for green buildings, they're going for low carbon transportation, and even also mini hydro plants. These are the guys are getting the investments where at low credit rates. But Malaysia is still far off from Singapore as well as Indonesia in terms of investment. And we want to push and spearhead Malaysia into the forefront of investments in carbon neutrality. There's an organization called Carbon Disclosure Project, which probably it's a non-profit organization. If you get a chance, you should go and visit their website. They really disclose all the kind of projects that many countries embark and the kind of value creation it brings into from a sustainability perspective. And that's phenomenal. In the book, you will read in page 60, climate change action plans for Malaysia companies. We've also shared about what Malaysia companies are doing in terms of climate planning. So you should also get a chance to pick up that book in page 60, look out for it. Page 63, we talk about risk and opportunities for Malaysian companies. we talk about political shift in the regulators in terms of what they can do from green trading perspective. We see supply chains being disrupted, where less is more. Can we now start looking at how do we disrupt the supply chain that we have? You see a shift in capital allocation. Green means more funding at a lower cost of capital. So you're going to see the shift in capital allocation happening also. You're going to see investments to have green projects much more accessible for funding. You're going to see a huge shift in youngsters, your next set of talents, embarking into and pushing for climate change and climate change for all the projects that they do. People are going to say, it's great doing digital projects, but what does it mean for the climate? And what does it mean from sustainability? And that's where the youngsters from Generation Y and Generation Z will be asking all of us as leaders of companies in today. I want to leave you with only three things. What we call the ABC of climate change. What do you mean by ABC of climate change? ABC, action for the betterment of climate, action for the betterment of community, action for betterment of for carbon reduction. What do you mean by A? A means purely take an action-oriented program or project within your own company. Put a target whereby the next 3 years you will be carbon neutral. B, whatever you do, what is the betterment for the community at large? How does this betterment comes and benefit your customers, your vendors, as well as your employees? C, start tracking your carbon emission. Start tracking about how do you spend carbon emission in your own respective projects, companies, and organization, in such a way that you start tracking how this carbon emission brings benefit to the community at large. So I want to leave you with A, B, C of this particular program. And we're very delighted to work with UN Global Compact, Bloomberg, as well as University of Nottingham to launch this first ever initiative in Malaysia. And we think this will help every one of you embark into this carbon neutrality journey in the coming years. Thank you, Feroz. Thank you for the entire team. We're delighted that we were part of this particular program, and we hope we can make a difference in Malaysia and in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jivan Raju. So before we proceed to the event, we would like to gain your feedback on whether your company is aiming to commit a net zero target in the future. We will be launching a poll, and we really would appreciate it if you could answer this poll. All right, so the question is, do you think your company will commit to a net zero target in the near future? For example, maybe within 5 years. All right, thank you for your feedback. Up next, we are joined by Mr. Justin Wu, the head of Asia Pacific of Bloomberg NEF. Bloomberg NEF is a research group within Bloomberg LP covering clean energy, advanced transport, digital industry, innovative materials, and commodities. Justin currently manages the company's research and consulting businesses across a dozen countries in the region, working closely with governments, investors, and corporations to help them develop business strategies in the low carbon transition. A leading expert on renewable energy, corporate sustainability, and decarbonization policy in Asia, Justin has been quoted extensively in international media and has previously testified before the US Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. I would like to pass the mic to Justin to share on the future of business trade in a net zero economy.
Thank you very much, Naja, for the introduction. I will just share my screen right now. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank the UN Global Compact Network Malaysia and Brunei for not just giving me the opportunity to come and speak to you this morning, but also for organizing this event. I think it's actually a really timely and important event, as you heard already. It's great to see that businesses in Malaysia are taking this very seriously and thinking about how to operate in the world of, as the topic of net zero becomes more popular. For us, you mentioned earlier about the Earth Overshoot Day, and I think it's actually quite a good, timely, I think it's a great day actually to have this event. Just maybe one little fact on Earth Overshoot Day. Last year, it was August 14th, and that was the first time, I think, in 40 or 50 years that it actually moved backwards because of the pandemic. Of course, it's kind of a bittersweet, I think, situation because the pandemic slowed a lot of things down. We had Earth Overshoot Day 2 weeks later. But back in 1970, when I think this started, it was on December 29th. So in the short span of a few decades, actually, we've moved almost 6 months forward with Earth Overshoot Day. So clearly, this is something that's moving not in the right direction, and I think something that we all need to think about and address. So today, what I want to do is actually for my presentation is three things. One is to set the scene a bit about what's happening now in the world of decarbonization. Why are we talking about this so much, and what does it actually mean for businesses and companies in Malaysia and around the world? And then, finally, in the end, maybe share some thoughts on what we can expect and what might come next. A lot of what you'll see in the slides are research that's done by our group at Bloomberg NEF. If you're interested in finding out a bit more about it, feel free to contact me with email or speak to the organizers who can also get in touch with us. So just to start with, if we think back the last year and a half or so, I think the biggest news that all of us remember is the pandemic. And of course, that's still ongoing. But a bigger story, and perhaps a more optimistic one, is that we've really turned a corner in terms of our seriousness in addressing climate change. And by that, actually, there's a very concrete measure of that. And that's the amount of emissions that are in the world that are covered by some sort of net zero discussion. So at the start of 2020, only about a third of the world's emissions, so in countries around the world, only about a third of those emissions were covered by some sort of net zero discussion. And most of that was actually in Europe. But by May 2021, just about 2 months ago, we're now at over 2/3 of the countries in the world with some sort of net zero discussion. And this has obviously spread now beyond Europe. Last year, we saw that major economies in Asia, such as China, Japan, South Korea, also joined part of the net zero club. Recently, we've also heard about countries in Latin America as well, setting goals or at least discussing about net zero. And as we prepare for COP26, we might expect more ambitious pledges from countries. So this is great, actually. This is a really good news, and I think something that we can be happy about for now. But of course, how we achieve these goals is entirely different matter. So let's take a moment and look at why countries suddenly feel more confident to make these pledges and why we're at this place right now. Javan also mentioned some numbers about investment earlier, but if you look back in the last 15 years, what we've seen is that energy transition investment, so investment into low carbon technologies, have really increased very dramatically. We started tracking numbers back in 2004, about more than 15 years ago. And back then, you can see that about $33 billion were invested, mostly in venture projects or demonstration projects around renewable energy. But last year, we reached $500 billion invested in these technologies, which is a new milestone. That's even in the midst of the pandemic itself. Most of that went into wind and solar projects, but a growing portion, as you can see on this chart in green, is in infrastructure related around electrified transport. So that's something that's also been increasing recently. Some of the other decarbonization technologies which we'll need more of in the future, whether it's energy storage, hydrogen, or carbon capture, haven't received that much money yet, but clearly it's something we need to watch and something we need to increase dramatically if we want to reach many of our goals. And of course, the reason we've seen so much investment go into clean energy is because the costs of these technologies have been falling. Actually, in the last 10 years, only let's say only a slice of people, whether it's in companies, governments, or investors, were talking about the energy transition. But now it's become much more mainstream. But the reason why people started talking about it, and more people are starting talking about it, is essentially boils down probably to something like this chart. The cost of power generation from renewable technologies has been falling very dramatically to a point that they've been converging and falling below that of fossil fuels for most countries around the world. Even though in Southeast Asia, and particularly in Malaysia, in these countries, a lot of fossil generation still remains cheaper than renewable energy. It's only a matter of time when that's also the crossover point will also happen, even in Southeast Asia and Malaysia as well. You can see here some of the newer technologies, such as battery storage, have also come down very sharply as a result of scaling up of manufacturing capacity in batteries that go into electric vehicles. And for the first time, we're also looking at coal and gas generation with carbon capture and storage, obviously significantly higher in cost still, as well as hydrogen produced from renewable electricity. But these are things to watch. And it's a question about whether we can invest more into these technologies, scale them up, and investors becoming more confident in these technologies and therefore reducing the cost of financing them. We'll see costs of these coming down as well in the future. All this takes us to a point where renewable electricity is no longer on the fringes. Wind and solar, for instance, now account for about 10% of electricity generation worldwide. If we let these cost and economic trends continue, we expect them to reach about 56% in the next 30 years. You can see now that fossil fuels still account for almost 60% of the world's power generation today. But in about 30 years' time, they'll fall to only about 24%. So obviously that's great. That's a massive transformation of the power system. And two things you have to remember about why this is so important. One is that obviously power demand is still growing, especially in emerging economies. So even as power demand grows and the share of renewable energy is growing along with it, means a lot more renewable electricity is entering the system and being used by countries around the world. The second point is that the power sector accounts for the largest portion of global emissions. So the fact that we're able to decarbonize a large portion of it is also significant for the climate as well, because of the amount of carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions that result from the burning of fossil fuels used to make power and heat. However, as you might have figured out by now, we're talking about net zero, which means that we're talking about by 2050, we shouldn't be putting any new carbon or greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So still having 24% of our electricity, of a much bigger electricity system being generated by coal and gas is still not good enough. And that's obviously not quite a net zero goal that we will reach by that year, given the current trends that we're on, even though they're very positive. Another area is transport, and transport probably accounts for the second largest portion of global emissions after power generation. And again, here we see also some positive trends, even though it's starting from a very small base. So the sales of passenger electric vehicles, obviously, sales of cars are still growing around the world as economies develop and people become wealthier in certain countries. But we see that 4.4 million electric vehicles are expected to be sold this year, accounting about 4.5% of all total passenger vehicle sales around the world. So again, a very positive trend starting and a fast growing one starting from a low base, but still clearly, the question is whether this is fast enough and whether this is enough for us to reach a net zero goal in the next 30 years. And the answer is that it's not quite at that level yet. Nevertheless, it's prompted a lot of interesting things to happen. One is that actually companies, so major auto manufacturers, are catching on to this. So just a few months ago, GM, which is one of the big three auto manufacturers in the US, is promising to go green by, first of all, making all its global operations and vehicles carbon neutral by 2040. But more interestingly, and perhaps more significantly, is the fact that it wants to sell only zero emissions models by 2035. In other words, it's trying to phase out its internal combustion engine vehicles in just 15 years. And as you know, they're not the only ones that have made this pledge. A number of automakers in Europe have already done this before them. And also automakers in Asia now are thinking something very similar. So in the short span of perhaps 15 to 20 years, we could see that most major automakers in the world could be moving away from selling internal combustion engine vehicles. Is a very big change, and obviously it has implications across the entire economy on many levels. Not only companies though, recently in the news we hear a lot about sustainability, ESG. There is a lot of activity coming from the investment community as well, and this is probably one reason why it's you hear a lot of this on the news. So one measure of, let's say, investor interest in these topics is the TCFD, which is called the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures. Put simply, the TCFD is a framework for companies to report how they manage climate risk to investors. So in other words, more and more investors are asking questions about to companies about what are you doing about climate change? If 66% of the world's countries or emissions are now going for net zero in 30 years, is your business still going to be aligned to that? What is your business plan? Are you going to continue as business as usual? So TCFD is one way of trying to answer that, give investors that answer about what companies are doing. And we see that TCFD membership has been increasing quite dramatically in the last couple of years. It's actually by now it's over 1,700 members. And a large portion of them are actually based in Japan, where actually is one of the countries that has seen a huge increase in TCFD membership. But more interestingly is that some regulators, including in the UK and as well as in Japan as well, are looking at making it mandatory for companies to follow the TCFD disclosure framework. In other words, making it mandatory for companies to explain to investors what they're doing on sustainability and aligning their businesses to a net zero world. So that's obviously a very significant, potentially could have effects across the economy. And investors are not only asking questions about what companies are doing. In some cases, they're becoming more stronger advocates of it. So you might have also heard in the news that just a few weeks ago, a group of activist investors known as Engine Number One essentially changed or voted out 3 board members of ExxonMobil in the US. And part of what they cited, of course, it wasn't the only reason, but one of the main reasons they cited was that the ExxonMobil as a company was not doing enough to address climate issues. So essentially, this was considered a surprise for a lot of people. But what's interesting about this is, and this is a quote from one of my colleagues at Bloomberg Intelligence, is that the fact that asset managers such as BlackRock were swayed by Engine Number One's cause is another sign that ESG issues and climate change in particular are now mainstream. So it's not so much that a small group of activist investors tried to change the board of a major energy company like Exxon, but actually mainstream and larger asset managers like BlackRock went along with it. So obviously, when we talk about mainstream, I think that's a really important word for us to think about. Mainstream can mean a lot of things. Obviously, it can mean mainstream amongst the public in terms of discussion, mainstream in government, but now also becoming mainstream in investors in terms of the way the investors think about this as well. So moving on to the next point, it is about companies. So we looked at countries, we looked at what investors are doing. Companies themselves now, obviously, for years they've written sustainability reports. There's always, cases. There's always a chief sustainability officer in many companies. But now many companies are becoming a bit more ambitious. In other words, now they're also pledging net zero goals or setting net zero targets for themselves. So as an example of this, we look at 3 sectors here: financials, oil and gas, utilities. So there's a surge in net zero commitments. It's also, partially driven by healthy competition between companies. What typically happens is that a leading company sets a target, and then this sets off a chain reaction amongst its peers and competitors, while also at the same time encouraging investors to put pressure on the sector. So in other words, a bit of a virtuous cycle begins when a leading company in the sector makes a pledge. It sort of drives other companies, investors, everybody else to follow along. So a notable example is as recently as December 2019, so not that long ago, Repsol, which is an oil company in Europe, set a fairly ambitious decarbonisation goal, which targeted Scope 3 emissions. And this resulted in a slew of other oil and gas companies, now up to 18, that have also set various Scope 3 emissions goals. So that's something that triggers a change very quickly over the course of only 1 year. More recently as October 2020, so less than a year ago, JP Morgan kicked off a burst of financial net zero targets in the finance sector. So this was then followed by HSBC, Macquarie, Bank of America, etc. So that's that's something that we observe as well, that dominoes can fall very quickly if one leading company pushes something forward. And you may ask that whether companies actually can make a difference, because after all, right, if you're a company, you might think that, okay, that's great. If I do something, I might trigger a bunch of my peers and competitors to do the same. Investors might be happy, but can I actually make a difference? Isn't it countries that actually make a big difference? Well, to a certain extent, yes, of course, that policies and countries need to lead in this, but companies actually can make a difference as well. So, some of the, one example is that, 83 companies that are part of a group called the Climate Action 100. So there's some of the, let's just call them some of the leading, largest companies in the world, but also some of the largest emitting, sort of carbon emitting companies in the world. So the net zero goal that they've set, if you combine all that together, it amounts to actually about 8.3 gigatons of emissions abatement if all these goals are met. And you can see here, 8.3 is more than the US's annual emissions. So that's the US is the second largest emitter in the world and close to China's emissions. So it's significant. If companies can pull their efforts together, it can add up to a lot. Just two oil majors in Europe, Shell and BP together alone can reduce more emissions than all of Japan. So again, some companies have an important role to play, and they're obviously can make a big difference as well. But while on the topic of companies, and of course this webinar is a lot about Malaysian businesses, I think there's two things I want sort of all of you to think about and take away. Even though you may believe that actually, well, a lot of these things are happening in a lot of other countries around the world, how does it impact businesses in Malaysia or more widely in Southeast Asia as well? So the two things to think about, and this sort of touches on the trade aspect of my presentation, is that one is that, for a lot of companies, it's that might be based in the US or Europe, when they set their sustainability goals, they expect their supply chain companies to follow suit as well. So for instance, the RE100 is a group of companies that pledge for to use 100% clean electricity for their operations. So even though a company like Apple or Walmart or Toyota, for instance, have made these pledges, most of their supply chain, in other words, most of their manufacturing is taking place across different countries in Asia. A lot of it in Taiwan or China, but actually a lot of it in Southeast Asia, increasingly amount in Southeast Asia. And if you think about these companies, if they want to build factories in the future, or if they want to expand and invest in supply chain in the future, they need countries where they need to come to places where they can source renewable electricity. So that's very important for them as well. The second point is, and you may have heard this in the news, is that governments now are looking at trade, using trade to address what they call imported emissions. And this is a somewhat controversial matter, of course, but there's a reason for this to happen, right? So one is that if you look at greenhouse emissions produced and consumed per capita, for instance, among some of the leading economies in the world, you can see, in US, in Germany, in France, but also in China and India, a large portion or the majority of it actually is imported emissions. So for some of these countries which have made net zero pledges, obviously, it's simply not good enough that domestically they can reach this goal. They are also going to look at, okay, the goods that I buy, the trade I have with the rest of the world, do I import my emissions? In the case of France, for instance, as a typical example of a developed economy, a lot of its greenhouse emissions of the goods that it buys is coming from imported emissions. And this is probably one reason why the European Union is now looking at carbon border adjustments and also using trade as a way to implement change in other parts of the world. So as a business, obviously, if you're not based in these countries, this is still something that you need to think about and keep in mind in the future if you want to do business in countries that have set much more stricter goals on reducing emissions for its companies and overall. So finally, just to wrap up, I just want to leave you with 2 points. I've discussed a lot about companies, investors, and countries. So if we zoom out a little bit and just think about what we need to do. So, it's great that we set 2050 as a goal. And for many people that may seem like, well, they may think one thing. One is that 2050 is still a long time away, 30 years. And secondly, okay, if I've set a goal, that's great. I can maybe worry about it in 20 years. I'll just continue as business as usual. But if we're serious about our climate goals, actually, that's not really the case. So if you think about the environment, this is the carbon budget that the world has. If we do nothing right now, we're looking at about 3.3 degrees of warming by the end of this century. If you actually want to reach any of our climate goals, which is no more than 2 degrees of warming, we have to bring our emissions down in one of these trajectories, one of these curves, all of which leads to zero emissions by 2050. So you can think about the choices here. One is that we can go very, very quickly. If we want to reach 1.5 degrees or no more than 1.5 degrees, we have to go very, very quickly and bring emissions down within this decade. And you can see this yellow line, which is sharp decrease. Or if we choose to wait, let's say another 15 or 20 years before we do anything, we can follow this 2-degree pathway. But it obviously makes the 10 years between 2040 and 2050 a very chaotic one. So often people may say we need an orderly transition, and what that implies is that we need to, we're not ready to do this yet, right? We need to do it in a way that maintains economic and social security, which means minimizing the yearly rate of emissions reduction. But the choice is really not is often between do we do it now or do we do it later, and it's not an easy choice to say that let's wait 20 years, do nothing, and then figure it out in the next 10 years. When new technologies are available. Certainly there are some technologies that need to become more mature and we need to wait, but that doesn't mean that we continue business as usual and simply keep things moving forward. And the final point I'll make on this is that similarly, if we want to make this change, all sectors of the economy are impacted. I mentioned earlier that the blue here, which is the power industry, followed by aviation, shipping, and transport. These are the largest contributors to emissions. But net zero really involves the whole economy. So all these sectors which contribute to emissions, all these aspects of the economy, at some point they need to reduce their emissions. So it's not a matter of who does it or what who does it first, etc. It's something that everybody needs to do. I think it's important to remember, first of all, that many people see this as a risk or as an obligation, but we always like to say that this is an opportunity, right? There's a lot of new investment and technologies that are needed to get us to where we need to, and businesses that can move quicker and can figure this out and become more aligned to this trajectory are the ones that will thrive in the future economy. So this is important to think about, to be prepared for it, and also to see it as a new opportunity for you to pursue. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this gives you a view of what lies ahead. I think right now there's a lot to be optimistic about with regards to what business, governments, investors are doing to address climate change. But of course, as I mentioned, there are massive challenges ahead. And as this issue becomes more mainstream and more widely known, it also means that action solutions have to come from everyone, not just those of us who are directly involved. So thanks very much for listening, and I hope hope this gives you some food for thought. So thank you.
Right, thank you, Justin. I hope we all learned something and are able to set our own climate ambition from Justin's insightful sharing on how major businesses have taken the steps to transition to a climate-friendly operation. Up next, we are joined by our distinguished speaker, Dato' Engineer Dr. Siti Hamisah binti Tafsir, the Secretary General of Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, mostly through a video recording. Her role as the most senior civil servant in the ministry is to provide a leadership in the development of the country's policy and strategic direction in science, technology, innovation, and the economy. She is also responsible for the research, development, commercialization, and innovation grants, as well as the debt and equity agencies of technology startups in Malaysia. I would like to invite Dato' Engineer Dr. Siti Hamisah binti Tafsir to give her keynote speech and further launch the MYClimateAction Guide via video recording.
Good morning, everyone. Mr. Farouz Nada, Executive Director, UN Global Compact Network Malaysia and Brunei, UNGCMYP, Mr. Jevan Raju, Country Head Tata Consultancy Services, TCS, Associate Professor Dr. Mohan Avari, Nottingham University Business School, Dr. Chiang Giok Lian, CEO and Principal of SENTRAL College Penang, private sector guests, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. I'm deeply grateful to UNGCMYB and partners for this opportunity to officiate the launch of the MYClimateAction Guide this morning. It's indeed an honor for me and privilege to be able to engage the private sector on a topic that is not only crucial for our economic resilience, but also for the survival of the planet, especially during this unprecedented time where we are facing with COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, scientists have studied global warming for so many years. These experts have tested hypotheses, collected evidence, constructed models, analyzed data, and debated scenarios. Thousands of papers are written every year, both academic and also in the mainstream. Even blockbuster Hollywood movies have attempted to highlight the imminent danger awaiting us, and yet we meet today standing at the precipice of reaching climate tipping points that scientists say will bring irreversible cascade of climate events that could lead to an existential threat to civilization. Globally, countries and companies alike are embarking on a race to zero in transitioning towards carbon neutrality. Closer to home, Malaysian leaders are waking up to the economic and societal potential of a green economy, and interest level have been growing exponentially, strengthened by regulator support. As a stakeholder, the government has been at the forefront of introducing effective policies to help combat climate change while ensuring fair and equitable growth. Sustainable development and by extension, climate change policy have always been at the heart of government planning, beginning with the 8 Malaysia Plan, 2001 till 2005, highlighting the importance of the transition to renewable energy. The climate change agenda has been carried throughout successive Malaysia plans and continues to be the central piece in the 12th Malaysia Plan that is going to be launched soon. Other policies include the National Policy on Climate Change Malaysia, emphasizing the conservation of the environment and natural resources to ensure climate resilience. National Green Technology Policy, promoting the central role of green technology in Malaysia's green development, and Green Investment Tax Allowances, GITA, and Green Income Tax Exemption, GITA, incentive schemes to strengthen the development of green technology in Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, although Malaysia has pledged at the Rio Earth Summit in 1932 to keep at least 50% of our land mass as forest cover, but we are committed to preserve as much as possible. And currently, we are proud to say that we are at 55.3%, and this is something to be proud of. With international support under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, mechanism for sustainable forest management, and especially with the heightened attention given to forests as a vital climate change mitigation tool, I believe we should be able to hold off for the conversion of forested land and ensure our forest cover remains high. Malaysia's participation in Expo 2020 Dubai aims to display our nation's commitment to sustainability, including the UN Sustainable Development Goal. Our pavilion is aligned to net zero carbon, and this is very much in line with the UN SDG Goal 13 on climate action, and our net zero carbon program aims to leave the most minimal carbon footprint. Our first initiative involves the planting of 500 kapo trees, which are endangered species. There are just a few examples of the many other climate-related policies and programs intended to spur the green economy and help keep the nation competitive in changing global business landscape. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is a complex, multi-dimensional problem, and effective and sustainable response to climate change requires strong public, private, and community collaboration. It demands the best, most up-to-date assessments of the issues made in a holistic and multidisciplinary way. The capacity to produce, select, adapt, and disseminate knowledge is within our capacity today. The role of science, technology, and innovation, STI, could not be clearer. The climate emergency has heightened the critical importance of science and technological innovation to achieve sustainable climate change outcomes. As the wealth of the world's economies is built on the intensive exploitation of scientific and technological knowledge, science also underpins the global consensus on the need for action. At the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, mostly we are embarking on the National Policy on Science, Technology and Innovation, NPSTI 2021-2030, that links to the economy and society. The new policy outlines 6 strands along with 20 strategies and 46 initiatives covering all sectors, including renewable energy and climate change, which is critical in addressing what we are talking today. To realize the goals of NPSTI 2021-2030 policy framework, namely 10 on 10 Malaysian Science, Technology, Innovation and Economy, MYClimateAction, integrates 2 major sectors, STI and economics, using 10 global science and technology drivers with 10 socio-economic drivers in the country. One of the 30 niche areas in MYClimateAction framework is energy. There is a need to enhance renewable energy contribution to primary energy supply in order to construct a more sustainable and green Malaysia, which will help in the race of reducing the impact of climate change to the country. But science, like policy, can only do so much in the fight against climate change. What we need is action. Science has made it abundantly clear climate change is happening. We are the cause, we need to act. This is where the private sector can fulfill its role best as a critical partner in delivering the wanted or required climate change outcomes. As business practice has been associated with environmental pollution and degradation, it also plays an important role in driving green growth in a carbon neutral economy. Informed business leaders recognize climate change as an opportunity and are now leading the charge equipped with new business purpose, cleaner technologies, new business models, and adopting science-based target to assist scientists in the fight. This is important as according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, a range of stabilization scenarios are achievable with a portfolio of technologies, some of which are already available. Furthermore, the private sector can empower greener behavior across the supply chains that they manage. Investors and banks are potential sources of green investment for clean infrastructure, and businesses and entrepreneurs can provide the skills and knowledge leading to innovation in clean technologies and resource efficiency. Ladies and gentlemen, our roles are clearly defined. We have the resources, we have the technology, and we have a compelling reason to act. What we do not have, however, is the luxury of time, as the window of opportunity for reducing emissions and combating climate change is closing rapidly. Mitigation and adaptation action in these and the coming decades is crucial to avert the climate tipping points. We need to accelerate the transition to a sustainable low carbon economy now. The private sector and entrepreneurs need to rise to the occasion to play their part in this transition process. We must therefore accelerate the deployment and enhance the accessibility of existing clean technology. We must redouble our efforts to diffuse and transfer proven technologies. At the same time, we should continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Ladies and gentlemen, in parting, we must all work collaboratively and contribute to solve the climate emergency before they fester into unrecoverable tragedies. On that note, I take this opportunity to congratulate UNGCMYB and partners and applaud all of you from the private sector on this landmark event in the fight against climate change, and with this launch, the MYClimateAction Guide. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Engineer, Dr. Siti Hamisah binti Tapse. With that, the My Climate Guide action is officially launched. Up next, we would like to welcome Jess Yeo. Jess is currently the Research and Advocacy Lead for UN Global Compact Network Malaysia and Brunei. She leads and manages strategic research and advocacy plans, which are aligned to the UNGC 10 principles and the SDGs, generates white papers and guides, and builds sustainability assessment frameworks for various private sectors in Malaysia. Academically, she holds an MBA from Nottingham University Business School and has completed her management project of building a sustainability assessment framework for Malaysian SMEs. I would like to pass the mic to Jess to further introduce us to the My Climate Action Guide. Jess?
Yeah, thank you for the intro, Nachwa. So good morning, everyone. My name is Jess, and I'm happy to be part of the team to develop the Climate Action Guide. So on behalf of my team today, I'll be giving you a brief overview on the website and how to use the guide. Next slide, please. Okay, so our Earth is warming, and according to NASA, last year was one of the 3 hottest years ever measured. So if you have been following the news in the past week, we have been confronted with headlines next. Yeah, such as the deadly flood happening in Europe and China, wildfires burning across North America, as well as prolonged and severe droughts in certain parts of South Africa. Next. But the silver lining is, as mentioned already by Justin in his speech, as the world struggles with increasing climate change challenges, as well as the Delta variant of COVID-19, there has been a heightened commitment among world leaders, such as US, China, Japan, EU, and South Korea, as well as investors and businesses towards net zero. So in Malaysia, we are also witnessing a growing momentum towards the climate agenda among regulators, such as Bank Negara Malaysia, Securities Commission, Bursa Malaysia, institutional investors, as well as businesses. So all of these are really good news, but what does this mean to companies in Malaysia? So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so we did an analysis on the top 100 public listed companies in Malaysia, and we found that 77% of the companies acknowledge that climate change does have an impact on their businesses. That being said, although 74% and 73% of the companies have climate-related strategies and actions in place, less than 40% have actually set tangible climate-linked targets. For example, reducing X% of greenhouse gas emissions by X year. So next slide. Okay, by looking at the results, more ambitions, actions, and accountability needs to be taken by corporates in Malaysia. So this is also why we built the My Climate Action Guide. Our guide aims to cover the why, the how, and the what of climate actions. So to summarize, number 1 is to build the business case. Number 2 is to factor in a non-technical and holistic approach for organizations to embark on their climate actions. And the third is to produce a localized body of knowledge for our stakeholders. So I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the team who built this guide. So this guide was jointly developed by a team of dedicated researchers as well as subject matter experts from UN Global Compact Network Malaysia and Brunei under the leadership of our ED, Mr. Farouz Nada, in collaboration with our strategic partner, TCS, Tata Consultancy Services, as well as knowledge partners, Nottingham University Business School and SENTRAL College, Penang. Next. Okay, so where can you get the guides? We have built an interactive website which showcases some highlights which you can also find in the guide, such as the physical climate risk as well as transition risk faced by Malaysian companies, and a framework to guide you in setting up a robust climate strategy. So as you scroll down in the homepage of the website, you can find the 3 guides which I was talking about, which address the why, the how, and the what of climate actions. And we have received some private requests just now from you in the audience asking for our website link. So we'll share it to you towards the end of our event. Next slide. So overall, what you will get from the guide is 4 core beliefs to transform business outcomes, 1 framework, which is a total climate management framework, which I will explain a little bit more in the next few slides, over 10 tools which accompanies the framework, 4 localized case studies, and over 30 global and Malaysian resources to guide you on your journey. And even better, they are all free to use. Okay, next. Okay, so before I give you a brief overview of the key elements of the guide, I should probably let you know about the rationale of our design, because instead of the usual graphics most of you might expect from a climate guide, with photos of nature such as lush rainforests, blue skies, oceans, etc., we decided to use competitive cycling instead. Why? Because we see many similarities between this sport and the race towards net zero. Both are a race against time, both require discipline, strategy, consistency, and intense focus. However, unlike competitive cycling, climate change is a game that we cannot afford to lose. With that, let me bring you through the key components of the 3 guides. So next slide. Okay, so for the main book, the first book, which is the main book, talks about the why. So the guide will bring you through the physical and transition risks and opportunities expected to be faced by Malaysian businesses, both large and small. For Malaysia, climate change poses an asymmetrical challenge. So on one hand, our impact on global emissions is tiny. We only contribute less than 1% total global emissions. But on the other hand, our country and businesses are extremely vulnerable to the effects of climate change. For instance, sea level rise, floods, and water stress. So let me show you one of the projections of sea level rise, which is in our guide. Okay, so the image you are looking at is the coastal area in Selangor, which includes Port Klang. And it's projected by 2030, the areas covered in red will be below water level. And in the next slide, slightly more areas are projected to be below sea level by 2050. And that means the entire Port Klang is projected to be below sea level in less than 10 years. And of course, there are other locations on the map which you can explore on our interactive website. And I would say this trend is pretty alarming for countries like Malaysia, where around 70% of our population live and work in the coastal zones. And also, there are a lot of activities happening in the area, such as manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, ports, jetties, tourism, etc., which is definitely a risk for businesses with activities or supply chain which cover those areas. Okay, next slide. So transition risk will happen as a result of the global governmental and economic shift towards a low carbon future. We took a big picture view to assess the international climate landscape, the latest climate development highlights by our major trade partners in Malaysia, such as China, Singapore, US, Japan, and in Malaysia, we also look at the various initiatives by regulators and financial institutions. And from there, we came up with a concise overview of the transition risk and opportunities for Malaysian businesses. So some of these recent opportunities are listed here where you can find in the guide. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of you in the audience may already be very, very familiar with the business case, and this is where the second book is for you. So the second book talks about the how, and central to this guide is a framework called the Total Climate Management to help you craft a robust climate management strategy. The 5 key components to this framework, number 1 is the value case. So in order to gain buy-in from leaders at the top to embark on the climate agenda, you have to first build a compelling value case, basically the business advantage and the cost of inaction. The second one is efficacy. So the efficacy component encourages businesses to leverage on efficiencies across all functions. So basically to start with the low-hanging fruits and the efficiency enhancing activities, for example, quality management or digitalization. Then only think of scaling with technology in the next phase. As for the culture component, taking on climate action such as science-based targets should be the responsibility across all levels of management, as well as actors across the value chain. And there's too much jargon out there in the field of sustainability, and to truly get everyone on board, corporate climate speak must be kept simple and concise. So for communication, we talk about the importance of utilizing the fundamentals of effective climate communications to inspire action, build trust and behavioral changes. And finally, no matter how good we are, we cannot do this alone. So building partnerships is at the core to combating climate change, be it within the organization or with governments, civil society, or educational institutions. So there are 11 accompanying tools and resources that support this framework. And please refer to it for your initial process of taking climate actions next. Yeah, so these are the frameworks that attach with the framework. So next, please. So in the final book, we address the what. You might want to know who are the Malaysian companies who have already embarked on climate actions and what are they doing. So we interviewed some key sustainability leaders from companies such as Petronas, Sarawak Energy, MRCB, and Axiata, who have already made ambitious pledges such as net zero or have committed to setting science-based targets. The case study talks about the activities that companies are already embarking on from a product, service, strategy, culture, or supply chain perspective. Okay, so this is our climate guide in a nutshell. We put in a lot of energy in producing this guide, but of course, we also had fun and learned a lot while researching. So we hope this guide and the tools we built will benefit you in building your business case and approach your climate strategy from a holistic perspective. And of course, we understand the topic of climate change is evolving rapidly, and we will be updating the guide from time to time. So you're welcome to provide any feedback to us after reading the guides. So thank you for listening, and back to you, Nachwa.
All right, thank you, Jess. So with that, we have come to the end of the launch. So before we end this session, we would like to gauge on your organization's climate action. We will be launching a poll, and we would really appreciate if you can answer the poll that is given right now. So the first question is, my company has set actionable targets related to climate change. The second one is, are you familiar with science-based targets for climate change? And the third one is, what is the most important element to accelerate climate action in your organization, in your opinion? All right, I think we have the answers. Oh wait, some people are still answering, sorry. All right, thank you for your feedback. Now I would like to invite the speakers to take a photo, to take a group photo all together. So maybe you can just look in the camera and then just smile for a while. It takes a bit. All right. All right. How about our technical team? Are we done with taking photo? I think we should, right? Yep. All right. So once again, thank you for joining us this morning for the virtual launch of the MYClimateAction Guide. We also would like to express our gratitude to our speakers, Dato' Engineer Dr. Siti Hamisah binti Tapsir, Mr. Jivan Raju, Mr. Justin Wu, Mr. Farus Nada, and also Jasio for sharing their insightful thoughts and presentations with us. You can access the MYClimateAction Guide through the link provided in the chat box. We are more than happy to keep in touch with you via social media. Do follow and like our official pages on LinkedIn and Facebook. And for more info on UN Global Compact Malaysia and Brunei, feel free to contact us at info@ungcmalaysia.org. Thank you and have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.